Alright, so this is a video that I've been wanting to make for a long time. Way back in November of 2017, when they first announced that they were going to make an animated Mario movie, it got me thinking about what a proper Mario movie could be. And so I started working on a video about it, but like a lot of my projects, it turned into this big, ambitious thing, and I think it just got so overwhelming that I just gave up. And then when they announced the voice cast last year, all of those thoughts just came flooding back. And so the same thing happened. I started working on a video, I made some decent progress, but then life got busy, and that little voice in my head just started to tell me, this video isn't worth making, nobody's gonna care. But you know what? I don't care if people don't watch this video, I just need to get these thoughts out into the world. All that to say, when I tell you that I've been holding on to a lot of thoughts about this for a very long time, hopefully you understand my full meaning. On top of that, between that original announcement and now, Mario's former rival, Sonic, already has 2 movies out, and while they're not exactly masterpieces of film, general audiences have been pretty positive on the Sonic cinematic universe, I guess you can call it. I thought the movies were fine. As sort of a former Sonic fan, it appealed to my nostalgia well enough that I could tolerate some of the lackluster writing, but more than anything, it just got my gears turning even faster as I tried to imagine how this Mario movie might turn out. Because here's the thing. On paper, it doesn't really seem like a Mario movie should work, right? At least that seems to be a popular sentiment that I see floating around. After all, when you think about Mario, you don't think about how great the story is, you think about how fun it is to run and jump around, or how satisfying it is to finally complete that one level that was giving you a hard time. But you don't really consider Mario's personal motivations, you just know that Princess Peach has probably been kidnapped again, and Mario wants to save her because that's just what he does. But it's okay for Mario games to have such a shallow story because Mario games aren't about the story. One of the beautiful things about video games is that even when there is no story presented by the game itself, the story sort of just emerges out of the player's own actions. Mario games are compelling because they let the player tell their own story about self-expression through movement, and about how the player achieves mastery over the game's mechanics by learning from failure and by using the knowledge and skill that they gain to conquer increasingly difficult challenges. So really, the joy of a Mario game, or any game really, comes from how you interact with it. And then you have movies, which are completely focused on narrative. And yes, you could argue that a viewer can imagine themselves in the position of the movie's protagonist, and in a way, sort of experience the events of the movie vicariously through those characters, but even in that scenario, a movie lives or dies by how well it can present a story that resonates with the viewer on an emotional level. So I totally understand why so many people seem to believe that any Mario movie, regardless of the circumstances, is doomed to fail. Movies, as a medium, are seemingly antithetical to what makes Mario games fun. But I don't subscribe to this notion. I firmly believe that in the right hands, you could adapt Mario into an excellent movie. So the question that's been nagging me for almost 5 years is simply, how do you turn Mario into a good movie? So before we're given any trailers or plot synopsis, I wanted to step back and explore this question, completely removed from the context of this specific movie's production. We know that Illumination is making this movie, which already has people doubting that the movie will be anything more than mediocre, and we know that Miyamoto is working very closely on this project as well, which again has some people nervous considering that Miyamoto has been famously opposed to putting deeper stories in Mario games. And then you have that voice cast announcement, which has put some people so far over the edge that now they're just excited to see what kind of train wreck the movie can be. And of course, we all know how badly a Mario movie adaptation can turn out, but no use beating that dead horse. Instead, let's just imagine a Mario movie free from the corporate constraints and studio mandates, and let's just try to focus on what it would take to make a great Mario movie. Now, back in the day, when I originally started planning for a video about the Mario movie, I may have gone a little bit crazy and written up an entire story treatment that might have been over 9,000 words long, but right now I'd rather not subject you to what was essentially just fan fiction. Maybe, if this video essay does well, I might make another video about those ideas, but in this video, I wanted to talk about what I consider to be the Mario movie's two biggest obstacles. So basically, I just want to hardcore nerd out at you for like half an hour. Sound good? Well, it seems like you haven't left yet, so let's talk about obstacle number 1, the story problem. If you were to ask somebody why they believe a Mario movie wouldn't work, one of the most common points I suspect they would bring up is that there isn't a lot of substance to the story. If you're like most people, then you're probably thinking the movie would just be a generic damsel in distress story. And you would be totally justified in thinking that, considering that the games seem to treat that premise as a foundational element. There are a few exceptions, chief among them being Mario 2, which wasn't even originally intended to be a Mario game, but regardless, it's fair to say that Mario games have little to offer beyond just a simple premise to get the game started. But while the Mario franchise may not be famous for sophisticated stories, it is a franchise that's existed for well over 3 decades, and in all that time, the series has slowly accumulated quite a substantial amount of lore. It's not exactly all that deep, but it's still managed to capture the imaginations of the most die-hard Mario fans. The only problem is that all of this lore doesn't really coalesce into a more cohesive story that a movie would need to have. At least not in its raw form. The stories of each game are pretty disconnected, there's no real sense of a consistent timeline, it's really all over the place. But if you look in the right places, there are a number of narrative building blocks in the Mario canon that, when connected in the right way, could actually make for a compelling storyline. Now, at this point you might be thinking, so what, you've just described what an adaptation is supposed to be. Alright, fair enough, that pretty much is the goal of any adaptation, but I would be willing to assert that for most movie adaptations these days, especially when it comes to books or comics, a good story has already been told. And in those cases, the filmmakers essentially need to whittle away the parts that are less essential to get to the heart of what made the source material compelling. But when you're coming from the other direction and your starting point is far less substantive than a movie would need to be, it can be a lot more difficult to add onto that foundation without betraying what made people fall in love with the source material in the first place, especially with nearly 40 years of history to live up to. But I do think it is possible. In fact, there's a great example of a movie adaptation from recent years that was faced with similar creative challenges and, against all odds, actually succeeded. I'm talking about none other than 2014's The Lego Movie. Now, when this movie was originally announced, I personally wasn't paying very close attention to it. But from what I've managed to read, a lot of people were pretty skeptical that the movie would be anything more than a giant, soulless commercial for a toy. But somehow, the movie did manage to tell an engaging story. And I think part of the reason why the story resonates so well with audiences, or at least the reason I found it compelling, is that it doesn't attempt to draw from any one story, but instead it aims to capture the spirit of LEGO itself by focusing on themes of creativity, individuality, and self-expression. And of course it helps that the movie delivers these themes with a flair of self-aware humor that appeals not only to kids, who a studio executive might presume should be the target audience, but also to adults who are nostalgic for the simpler times of their own childhood when, presumably, they made LEGO creations of their own. The Mario series is in a pretty similar position. It's a series that many adults today grew up with, so there's plenty of nostalgia there, but there's also a very large temptation to make a movie that goes out of its way to only appeal to kids, which is a trap that's pretty easy to fall into. I think even the Sonic movies are guilty of that to some degree. But again, if a team of writers can just tap into that wellspring of creativity that the games have already established, I think it's very possible to create a new take on the prototypical Mario story that draws from the best parts of all the games. But before I can get into the specifics of what they could do to pull that off, we need to talk about obstacle number 2, the character problem. Compared to obstacle number 1, I think this might even be more daunting of a challenge. Now, if you were to go out and ask a lot of gamers what they think of the character of Mario, I'm betting a lot of them would tell you that they don't find him to be very interesting. And it pains me to say it, but I kinda have to agree. In all of my years of playing Mario games, I can't think of a single time where Mario's actions or circumstances have ever elicited any sort of profound emotional response from me. And maybe it's silly of me to expect that a movie about Mario of all things would be profound in the first place, but I think it's still worth talking about. Of course, there have been moments in the games where the nostalgia gets to me. I mean, who doesn't get a little bit emotional at the festival at New Donk City, for instance? But that has more to do with my own personal history with the games and less to do with the actual plot. Maybe that's just my own personal experience, but I would even go as far as to say that some of the other characters in Mario games are more compelling than Mario himself. And I would say that's by design. Mario's entire purpose is simply to act as a vehicle for the player's interactions with the world. So aside from a few generally heroic character traits, he's sort of just a blank slate. He's an extension of the player's intentions. So let's separate Mario from his role as the player's avatar and analyze him purely in narrative terms. You would probably categorize Mario as a static character, one that doesn't undergo any significant internal transformation during his journey. And while the games do sometimes have a sort of mechanical progression that a player might undergo over the course of a game, such as unlocking new abilities or power-ups, Mario himself doesn't undergo any real character development that's actually presented to us by the story itself. He starts his adventures as a very capable hero, and his only real hindrance is the player's ability to manifest the skills that he's already been shown to possess. In contrast to this, many of the most beloved characters in cinema are more dynamic. Over the course of their stories, we see them grow and change for the better, or sometimes for the worse. Now, I couldn't give you any sort of real statistic on this, but I would hazard a guess that the majority of stories in fiction from the last several decades are centered around dynamic characters. I think we're often drawn to these characters because we can relate to their struggles and celebrate their growth. And by witnessing their journeys, we are given hope that we too can bring about change or overcome adversity in our own lives. Now, that isn't to say that a story about a static character can't work well, particularly if you're dealing with a round character. But while Mario's a little bit physically round, his personality is pretty flat. He's presented very simplistically as a hero with no real nuances, no real shortcomings, and the player's just expected to accept that he is what he is and then get to the running and the jumping. Round characters are compelling because their stories offer a lens into their flaws and motivations. We're given opportunities to see what makes them tick, why they make the choices that they do. This enables us to empathize with the characters even if we don't necessarily condone their actions. If a character is well-rounded enough, then even when they don't really change, their stories can still resonate. To bring things back to Sonic, I think the movie did a pretty good job of rounding out his character and making him more relatable, even if his characterization isn't quite the same as it is in the games. But even in the games, there are times where I'm actually able to relate to Sonic, which is more than I can say for Mario. And again, that's totally fine for a game, but when it comes to a movie, I think something needs to change. So those are the big challenges. Number one, how do we create a feature-length story that expands on the best parts of the games when those games have so little focus on story? And number two, what can we do to transform Mario himself into a more compelling and well-rounded character while still staying true to what little we do know about him in the games? Well, just as Mario can jump over practically any hurdle, I think these creative problems can definitely be solved in a number of ways. And so in part 2 of this video essay, we're going to address these problems. So click the thumbnail on the screen or the link in the description so you can watch part 2.